Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Moore v. Harper panel discussion hosted by Voters Not Politicians. My name is Melinda Billingsley. I am the Communications Manager for Voters Not Politicians, and I'm just going to give a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. We are recording the event, and we will share it afterwards via our YouTube and Facebook pages. If you have any questions during the event, please submit them in the Q&A feature, and if you can please include your name and where you're joining us from. We will get to as many questions as we can in the time we have this evening. If you are a reporter or member of the media listening in and you have a question, please reach out to team@feldmanstrategies.com and we will schedule a follow-up conversation with you. And then lastly, we really welcome your feedback to help make events like this better. So you will find an event survey link in the chat at the end, and it will also be included in a follow-up email after the event. And with that, we are ready to get started. So I will introduce our moderator and the Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians, Nancy Wang.
Thank you so much, Melinda. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited about our program tonight. I am the Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians. We are the leading voting and democracy group in Michigan, and we empower citizens to take action to strengthen our democracy. So as we all know, Michigan is one of the key battleground states for federal elections. And that's why in 2020, we were the site of some of the most extreme election denying, election subverting behavior in the country. We were, the site of MAGA Republicans storming the TCF Center, demanding that they stop the absentee ballot count. We're the site where fake electors, a slate of fake electors were submitted by the Michigan GOP to Congress and the National Archives. We have a sheriff who's trying to seize voting machines from clerks in his jurisdiction in order to prove conspiracy theories of Trump. And we right now have the GOP training poll workers, telling them to break election rolls when they're at the polling location and serve as quote unquote secret agents. And throughout this, we also have our state legislature itself that's been playing an active role in trying to deny the right to vote to voters because they think that that will yield them an electoral advantage. And they've also been fanning the flames of some of these conspiracy theories. In 2020, they gave a platform to Rudy Giuliani to spout his conspiracy theories, even though everyone at that time and now knows that there was not a shred of evidence to support anything that he was saying. And then in the 2021 legislative session, they passed a raft of 39 voter suppression bills that had no public support, no clerk support. And they used a premise of voter fraud, saying that they needed to pass these bills to prevent fraud, even though we had 250 audits in the state, including a months-long investigation by the Senate leadership in the legislature itself, showing that there was no fraud in the election. So we have now, 2 months before Election Day, what we're seeing is we have election deniers up and down the ballot, including the Secretary of State's race, including legislative races where the candidates are saying that our elections are broken and these election deniers need to be voted in office to quote unquote fix them. And on the other side of the coin, though, we have voters who are fighting back and using our power to protect our voting rights and our democracy from our own state legislature and other actors who, like the parties that would seek to subvert it. And we've been using our power of direct democracy that's guaranteed in the state constitution. And we've been using the Constitution itself to put reforms in there that are wildly popular, that are pro-voter, pro-democracy, nonpartisan, like gerrymandering reform, which in 2018, Voters Not Politicians, we led that campaign to pass it to end gerrymandering so that we could vote out politicians that weren't serving us. And because 61% of voters, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, voted to pass a constitutional amendment, and we set up an independent commission, that independent commission then drew fair maps that give us, for the first time in decades, a chance to actually shift the balance of power in either one or both legislative chambers. And then in 2018, we also had another citizens-led initiative, also a constitutional amendment that enshrined in our Constitution things like no reason absentee voter for ballots for all voters, same-day registration, automatic voter registration, again, things that are pro-democracy that voters across the political spectrum support. That one won by 67% of the vote. And so these are examples of citizens using our own power in order to protect ourselves from our own state legislature, putting into our Constitution voting rights that the legislature wouldn't pass for us. And in 2022, we have another example because Voters Not Politicians is central to a coalition called Promote the Vote 22, where we are trying to protect our fundamental right to vote in the Constitution. And we're also trying to enhance some of these voting rights and also to protect our democracy by, for example, requiring that canvassing boards certify election results based only on votes cast, and preventing any other person or body other than a governmental body from conducting any audits, including any sham audits that we've seen in Arizona and other states. So there is this power struggle and it's playing out. And again, on the voter side, we have our Constitution, our right to direct democracy. And then on the other side, we have the state parties and the state legislature that have shown a willingness to use their power to keep themselves in power, even while it undermines our elections. And now in that kind of situation we're in, the US Supreme Court has now thrown this this Moore v. Harper case, and with it the possibility that they could give our state legislature overarching unchecked power to regulate our federal elections, to set rules that they want for our federal elections, and we couldn't do anything about it either by citizens initiative or a constitutional amendment or the Supreme Court or the governor. In that case, if it's decided by the Supreme Court a certain way, could threaten our elections in 2024, including the 2024 presidential. So here we have a panel tonight of distinguished panelists and scholars and legislative leaders and authors to discuss with us, what is at stake? What does Moore v. Harper bode for people like us in Michigan who are trying so hard to protect our democracy? What does that mean for us, and what should we as voters do about it? I'll introduce, first up will be Tom Wolf, who's Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. He's an experienced litigator and strategist. He leads the center's census project and other major constitutional litigation initiatives. He advises civil rights groups, state and local governments, and others on legal strategy and policy relating to democracy issues, particularly those with a high likelihood of US Supreme Court review. And next we will have Meaghan Winter, who's a magazine writer and author of All Politics is Local: Why Progressives Must Fight for the States. Her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, Essence, New York Magazine, Slate, and more. And also we have tonight Buzz Thomas, who many of you might recognize. He's a public affairs professional with more than 25 years of experience. He spent 14 years in the Michigan legislature, including serving as Democratic floor leader in the Senate and as Democratic leader in the House. So thank you again to all of our panelists, and I will yield the floor to you, Tom.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you everyone for coming out this evening. As Nancy mentioned, I'm Deputy Director with the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Among the things I'm focused on right now in terms of major constitutional litigation is the litigation about the independent state legislature theory in the Moore v. Harper case. I'll start here with the question that Moore presents, effectively whether a state Supreme Court or really any state court can nullify rules that state legislators have made for federal elections using state constitutional provisions. That's a bit of a paraphrase from what's in the brief, but I recognize that even that's a little bit of legalese. So let's unpack the underlying scenario and how we got there, which I think will help make the stakes in the argument in this case a bit clearer. So as a basic matter, in 2020 or the 2020 cycle, when it came time to draw maps, the North Carolina General Assembly drew congressional maps that are extremely gerrymandered in favor of the Republican Party. Voters in North Carolina recognized this issue, and they went to the North Carolina state courts with constitutional litigation to try to fix the issue, and they actually succeeded. So ultimately, they were able to work their way up through the state courts all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which affirmed that, in fact, there was a gerrymandering problem in the state. The court said that the gerrymander violated, amongst other things, state constitutional guarantees of free and fair elections, free speech, and equal protection, some of which have equivalents in the US Constitution and some of which don't. The gerrymanderers who gerrymandered the map were dissatisfied with this result, understandably from their standpoint, so they appealed to the Supreme Court. Their argument is basically this: the United States Constitution's elections clause bars any state government entity except state legislators or the legislature from making rules about federal elections, including congressional maps, which are effectively rules that tell people how their votes get aggregated when it comes time to cast ballots for Congress. Their theory of the case is based on this notion that is now being referred to as the independent state legislature theory, which is a fringe theory that first appeared in a sort of non-precedential attachment to a non-precedential opinion from the Supreme Court that resolved the Bush v. Gore litigation back in 2000. Because it was a non-precedential attachment to a non-precedential opinion, it was both kind of pushed under the rug and also widely discredited at the time. The issue popped up again in the mid-2000s around litigation around Arizona's Independent Redistricting Commission. And there the court took a position in a majority opinion by Justice Ginsburg that effectively rejected the ISLT. The issue didn't go away, though. It reappeared again in the 2020 elections, around the presidential election, where Trump campaign operatives, mainly, who were throwing kind of everything in the kitchen sink at the courts to try to figure out some way to change the results of the elections, made arguments in court about how particularly state courts couldn't alter the rules for casting ballots. Again, the Supreme Court rejected these arguments, but a few conservative justices on the court used concurrences and dissents to express either support for the ISLT or at least curiosity about it, suggesting that, at the very least, we should sort of dig more deeply into this question. So we have now ended up in a situation where the North Carolina legislators are trying to kitchen sink their way out of a ruling from the state court that threw out their gerrymander, and then reinstall their gerrymander by pointing essentially to just a few loose writings from a few conservative justices on the Supreme Court. The case currently is kind of in the middle of the briefing phase, so we don't yet know when the court's going to hear the argument, but the briefs in favor of the legislators have already come in, so we have a little bit of a fuller sense of what's actually going on in the case at this point. Here's what I want to highlight for our purposes. Happy to get into the procedural questions and calendar questions in the Q&A. When you pull together the collective case that's being made for the North Carolina legislators between their brief and the friend of court briefs that have been filed in support of them, it's a remarkably anti-democratic position. So returning back to the question presented, here's the way one of the amici in favor of the legislators are presenting the issue. They're saying this case basically puts the Supreme Court to a choice. Either state legislatures get to determine the rules for our elections, or state courts get to determine the rules for our elections. That's not actually what's going on in this case. What this case is about is whether the Supreme Court is going to continue to reinforce the system of checks and balances that has existed in this country since its beginning, centuries ago, or whether it's going to initiate a new rule that says for the first time, state legislators and state legislators only get to decide what the rules for federal elections are. They're advocating for a system where instead of checks and balances, we get legislative supremacy. What does that mean? Currently, a number of different people shape the rules for elections: state legislatures, governors using their veto power, state Supreme Courts using their judicial review power, state constitutions, which are both followed by all of these actors and then become the basis for judicial review, and voters like yourselves through ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court's ruling in this case at the end of the day is looking to strip away checks and balances, strip away voters' powers, elevate state legislators, and then make the US Supreme Court the ultimate arbiter of whether the legislators over here are behaving in a lawful manner. That is a frightening prospect and remarkably anti-democratic, no matter what sort of legal terminology is used to dress up what the technical issues in the case are. So that's generally what's going on. I'm happy to unpack that further, the nuances, but I also want to make sure that I'm minding my time.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks for just leaving us with the frightening prospect there. No, just kidding. Meaghan, I'd love to hear your thoughts too about state power and where that leaves us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And I love talking about this. So I'm going to start with something that makes more sense to end with, because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time too. And I don't want to forget this point. You all already know this, but I just want to say that you are important. And we have such a skewed vision living in a media ecosystem that prioritizes the national politics, Congress, that's obsessed with Trump. None of us have control over what the Justice Department does with Trump. We do, however, have some measure of control over these smaller, or what seem smaller, which are more incremental things that actually have a huge significance. And I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for being a part of this conversation, and to Nancy and all of you who are doing this work, because it's no pressure, everyone, but it's one of the things holding our democracy together, to have people coming together to do things like this. So I just don't want us to lose sight of that when we're talking about all these things that are really scary. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, some of which may be familiar to many of you, because I know you're more informed than many people are. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this long kind of tradition of changing the rules. As Tom was saying, this could potentially be changing the way elections are run, rather than just like some small policy tweak. And this notion that state legislatures would have control over elections might on its face seem sort of neutral, or you could even, I've heard the argument being made like, oh, that's a more direct form of democracy. But I want to just walk through a couple of reasons why that's not so, and why this comes from a fairly long tradition of ideological actors focusing on state level politics and state legislatures in particular to disempower voters. And again, some of this may be familiar to some of you, but I'm going to walk through some of the main things. So we know that states have a huge amount of impact. State policy affects so many things that have consequences for our daily lives. I'm going to read a quote from Stacey Abrams that I agree with. She said this in 2019. Most of the seismic shifts in social policy occur on the state level. The erosion of the social safety net started with Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin. He was the architect of welfare reform. Mass incarceration started with Ronald Reagan in California. Stand Your Ground started with Jeb Bush in Florida. Jim Crow never had a single federal law. It was all state law. So I read that quote to start because, again, as I was just saying, it's easy to be convinced of the opposite, given what's on TV, what we hear people talking about, et cetera. But for many years, starting soon after the Brown v. Board education decision in the 50s, when the Supreme Court required the integration of schools, libertarian and what we would now call right-wing donors decided that they would fund state-level policy to push their agenda. And by the 1970s, not only were they pushing racist bills about school segregation and funding, but they were also committed to changing the way our government functions. So Nancy McLean wrote a fabulous book. If you haven't read it, Democracy in Chains, wherein she quotes James Buchanan, who's sort of a grandfather type figure to Charles Koch. I mean, not in that they were actual mentors, don't want to misquote, but in that who's sort of a prototypical Charles Koch. Anyway, James Buchanan said, "Our focus must shift from changing who rules to changing the rules." So I think that's a really important thing to realize, that this has been happening for decades, that these ideological actors who are very well funded have been focusing on changing the actual rules, not just electing someone that they favor and not just pushing a policy about, this or that issue. They really have been trying to undermine the basic tenets of our democracy. And this is not my interpretation, although it is also my interpretation. This has been documented very well by historians, by scholars. This is directly out of the mouths of the people who've come up with these kinds of plans. And why? Why have they chosen the state level to execute these things? For numerous reasons. One, states have huge leeway. We live in a federalist system. Two, to a large extent, a lot of these actors knew that they would fly under the public radar. So, and this again is not my interpretation. This is things people have directly said, and it's been recorded. So Charles Koch said, "We know we're greatly outnumbered." This is a paraphrase. "We know we're greatly outnumbered, so we have to do these things in an incremental way through these state houses." So, because that this is, because these things are so often flying under the radar, things catch the public by surprise. Like, I covered abortion for many years, and there was an incremental legal strategy to chip away until finally people are aware of what was happening. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I want to just we'll get to some other things. Okay, so a couple things that I want to touch on before we're done, and we can talk in the Q&A too, is for a long time, while these ideological right-wing actors were so focused on the state level, where was the counterbalance? Where were the centrist foundations who have just as much money? Where were the Democrats? Where were the progressives? Where was anyone else who was a weight to that? And to a certain extent, a lot of those groups focused on federal elections, they focused on federal races, and they didn't have the same underlying premise that they were going to change the rules of the game, which is what these ideological libertarian, corporate, and Republican donors have done. There's too much history to give you, but I think the main points that I want to the main thing I want to emphasize to you tonight is that so many of the different social movements throughout this history have pushed on an incremental level to whittle away and disempower voters' stay in our democracy, and these things are becoming entrenched. And now I'll stop before I'm rambling, but I'll be happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Great. Meaghan, thank you so much. And Buzz, I'd love to hear your perspective as someone who has served in the Michigan legislature and what you see the legislature in our state doing with potentially more power over our federal elections.
Sure. Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everyone. It's interesting. I began my personal political career in 1996. That's when I ran for office, and I served through 2010. And the world in which I lived politically very much does not exist anymore. There actually was bipartisanship. Ironically, as a part of my orientation program for new legislators, it was suggested that I identify members of the other party to get to know and to befriend. Kind of, if you think about, there was it used to be an old Bugs Bunny cartoon where you'd have the Roadrunner and someone else or Wile E. Coyote off trying to kind of bludgeon each other throughout the day. Then the alarm bell rings, the day's over, and they go off and they have a drink together and they move on. And that was really ingrained within the politics in which I became elected and participated in. And it resulted in the ability for lawmakers to pass very meaningful pieces of legislation that were done in a bipartisan fashion, something that I would suggest just couldn't happen today. During this period of time, Wayne County Metropolitan Airport the authority that built the Wang County Airport, which is a key driver to the economy of Michigan, particularly Southeast Michigan. That was done in a bipartisan fashion. The renovation and expansion of Cobo Hall was done in a bipartisan fashion, created a governing body that, shock of all shocks, required all parties to act unanimously to be able to make decisions, so that essentially everyone had veto power over the others. But folks figured out a way to make that work. And in the first decade of the 2000s, Michigan Republicans and Democrats came together to pass a series of bills to allow for Michigan to make an application to the Department of Education for a program known as Race to the Top, which was a competitive program for states to secure education funding. And that required compromise between teachers, between educators, between charter schools, all of the various constituencies that you see now competing with each other, all coming together to work together. So I say that to say that that would not happen in my estimation. As I talk to some of my friends that are in politics now, one, they don't know their colleagues outside of their own party, and rarely do folks try to build those friendships, let alone those very key relationships and allyships that existed now 20 years ago. So instead, what we see is incredible hyper-partisanship that exists. The Michigan legislature had, through a process known as simply adopt and amend, has taken several steps to work around the will of the people and the role of the governor by adopting and killing citizen initiated acts on raising the minimum wage, as well as earned paid sick time, which recently actually courts just struck down as an unconstitutional being or an unconstitutional act. This legislature, as Nancy said in her opening, adopted 39 undemocratic bills that were part of a national program of 400 bills introduced across all of the states. All of them were largely identical, all written by the Heritage Foundation in large measure, that were highly undemocratic, and as Nancy said, they were all vetoed. So what did the Michigan Republican Party and GOP lawmakers do? They created a ballot initiative, again, with the sole intent to not actually collect signatures and take their cause to the people, to let the people decide whether or not they think this is a good idea. They, in fact, missed all of the deadlines required to do that. They did collect the signatures, and they have said that really within the past 4 weeks, that their goal is during the lame duck session to have the legislature pass this, adopt it, which would prevent the governor from being able to veto this legislation. So these are just some of the examples of really the hyperpartisanship and the consistent workaround that we're seeing from this Michigan legislature on issues of democracy. And as my time concludes, I'll continue to address a couple further points during your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Buzz. There's so much here. So we have a lot of audience questions, and I'd like to just start digging in. First with Tom, what kinds of rules, right, could we be looking at, right? So when a state legislature, let's say like ours, who's demonstrated a perfect willingness to go around the voters, should get this power, right, from the Moore v. Harper decision, what kinds of rules could they pass that could be anti-democratic with respect to our federal elections.
So I referred earlier to the system of checks and balances that currently governs the way rules are made, and I can put a little bit more meat on that. So when we talk about how elections are actually run, the rules are coming from a lot of different places. Obviously, there are statutes that the legislatures are passing. There are also rules and regulations that are created by, say, election officials at the state and local level that are designed to implement the rules that the legislatures are creating. Another way the rules are being made is through gubernatorial vetoes. Like, it's sort of a negative rule in that sense. It's like the governor saying, no, that's not going to be a rule. You have state constitutions, which frequently include rules in them. So probably maybe most close to many of the folks on this call, the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission was a ballot initiative, or the creation of a ballot initiative that amended the Constitution. So the Constitution for the state contains rules that say how maps should be drawn. Then you also have court rulings. So, courts are either construing statutes, or they're construing the Constitution, or construing regs and making additional rulings on top of that. So it's sort of the intersection from all these different actors acting that you get the full body of rules that shape the way elections run. If the ISLT were to become the law of the land, which currently it's not, and I also like the flag, although it's scary, like it is a winnable fight. I want to make sure that that's clear. Happy to unpack that too. Most of those rule-making mechanisms are going to go away, and the rules are going to disappear with them. And all we're going to be left with are the rules that the state legislature has created. Sorry, it's been a long day organizing. So that can mean a couple different things. It could mean that our election rules sort of become like Swiss cheese, where there are all these sorts of holes that should be filled, but they're not filled because the legislature now has not acted in order to fill them. That's understandable. It's basically impossible for state legislatures, particularly legislatures that don't sit for sessions that go the whole year, to possibly regulate every nook and cranny of an election. Also, election officials, even if they create very elaborate rules, they need discretion at the end of the day to do their work. Like something simple like, I don't know, a flood happens at their polling place. They need to have the ability to shift to another place. Things like that could go away. So in part with the ISLT, you're talking about a loss of rules. The other thing that can happen, and I think Nancy is signaling to this, is state legislatures also have fewer constraints on the rules that they might make. So anything a governor would veto, it can't get vetoed anymore. Anything a state court would overrule as unconstitutional can't be overruled as unconstitutional anymore. So, sort of think about all the different things legislatures have done that governors have vetoed or courts have said no to, and then flip them. So assume that they would then be the rule. That's sort of the world that the ISLT is opening up.
I hadn't thought of that before you just said that ISLT doesn't just mean that whatever the legislature wants trumps. It actually means that all of these other actors that are making rules for federal elections, they don't have the power to make those rules. So everything disappears. Unless the state legislature could kind of, they can't even deputize.
Yeah, we'll see a couple of points on that. I mean, again, in North Carolina, in certain respects, I would argue the case isn't actually an independent state legislature theory case. If you take the theory to mean that only the state legislature can draw the maps or create the maps, because the state legislature in North Carolina created a bunch of statutes that expressly delegates to the state courts the power to apply state constitutions to strike down and redraw maps. So that's sort of a tricky thing, but the ISLT could wipe that kind of stuff away too, not just the rules themselves, but the delegations of power to make the rules.
So great. So Meaghan and Buzz, I'm interested in what you both think. So here we are, and we hear that this is a potential result, right? If this happens and this happens, and like, what can we do proactively as voters, right, to best mitigate the risk that we have from an adverse Supreme Court decision? Like, what can we do as voters in advance of the election, right? In advance of this decision coming down in the 2024 election to kind of protect ourselves the most?
Meaghan, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm actually curious what Tom thinks about to what extent, which I've heard people say, and you never know, but the notion that this fake electors thing would happen, where there would be a full-on overturn of the presidential election in 2024. I'm curious of what Tom thinks about that. But I think in the meantime, something to pay attention to is there's going to be state House and Senate elections, including in Michigan. As far as I understand, Republicans control both chambers in the legislature in every swing state in the country. And I point out Republicans because there's been a history, as we know, of an increasing share of Republican both voters and politicians endorsing the big lie and seeming to have a disregard for voting rights almost across the board. So getting momentum around those races, in particular, the races in Michigan, seems to be a huge deal. If there is, especially, I mean, it's a huge deal for a number of policy reasons, of course, and everything, Nancy, you laid out in the beginning. But there's an even greater importance to those races if there is a real possibility that those the legislature will have discretion over the 2024 race too.
Yep. So, I'm gonna default to something that I think a lot of Black families talk about. I'm in my 50s. It was ingrained in me from my grandparents that just to be equal, you have to be twice as good just to be equal. And so I think as I think about this, well, I absolutely agree that we have to, frankly, pay attention to state legislative races as Republicans have done for the past 20 years. And they very meticulously focused in on state legislatures. But I think also so much of this is predicated on the big lie and its criticism that our elections are run inappropriately, unfairly, or that something's wrong. Part of that is something that we can fix in that we can actually better fund election officials, election administration, and while in Michigan we can certainly spend more money on election administration, but also as Michiganders we have an opportunity to ask the Congress to actually just pass the budget recommendation of President Biden to spend $10 to $20 billion over the next 10 years on election administration in the United States. So for me, taking away some of the excuse that elections are rigged by actually just really digging down and professionalizing elections and making sure that these folks have all of the resources necessary to run transparent, open, and thoughtful elections that people can have confidence in. I think that's a big step. I would also say that I think in the short term, we really do need to pay attention to boards of canvassers here in Michigan, and we've seen through just the most recent ballot initiatives where the state board of canvassers deadlocked 2-2 and was forced by the state Supreme Court to reverse itself and put Promote the Vote and the Reproductive Freedom for All initiative on the ballot because they essentially overstepped what their role was. And the GOP, Republicans in particular, have spent a lot of time rebuilding their membership on these boards of canvassers within local communities. And a lot of times we forget that Michigan is a very decentralized state when it comes to election administration. There's more than 1,600 elections jurisdictions. We've got the 83 counties. So there's lots of ways to get through the certification of elections or creating opportunities to not certify elections. And so if we don't, if we don't get a handle on those issues, I think we run the risk of creating problems, and that's a situation that I think that we can fix. It's in our power to fix, and we should.
Thanks, Buzz. Yeah, on the one hand, there's so much to do, right? But by identifying all the different things we can do, that also gives us some hope, right? So that it's not, all our eggs aren't just in one basket of hoping that the US Supreme Court makes the right decision, for example, right? There's also our state leg races, which you mentioned, Meaghan, and that's, I'll just plug Voters Not Politicians. That's something that, we really are, empowering people to really engage with. But then, like you said, Buzz, there's all this local government, and then there's just pushing back and getting out of this disinformation kind of environment, right? And I'm just thinking of what some of these clerks are saying, which is you get a lot of these election deniers. There's a whole campaign for some people to be recruited to be poll workers, to kind of infiltrate from the inside. But then once they actually go to the polling place or to the clerk's office and see how these things are run, then they come away with, just kind of a renewed kind of faith in the system, because they can see that everything is safe and secure. So thank you for identifying all the different ways that our members and the public in general can kind of work to strengthen and protect our democracy from developments like these. So I think, Tom, you've already sort of touched on this, but we have a couple of people who are wondering when we can expect a decision from the US Supreme Court.
Most likely before the end of June 2023. There will not be a ruling in this case before the midterm elections, so it won't have any effect on how the 2022, it's not going to have any effect, for instance, on the 2022 maps.
Great.
Would it be helpful for me to pick up on the Jan 6 aspect that Meaghan flagged?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand that the ISLT is many things, but one thing it is not is a license to coup. It is part of the toolkit of election subverters, but it's something that's different from fake electors schemes or sort of denying what the actual outcome of a state election is. But here's why I say it's part of the toolkit of a subverter. Let's look at the specific situation in which it was deployed in 2020. Pennsylvania's presidential elections. State Supreme Court stepped in and provided a 3-day extension for boards of election to receive ballots that are mailed in because of the combination of the problems that the Postal Service was having and COVID. Court was basically just like, in order to actually have a functioning election, we need to give people a little bit more time. One of the theories going on, particularly for the Trump campaign, was that vote by mail and votes that were delivered later would favor Biden over Trump. And so they thought, effectively, let's invalidate the ballots that arrive within that 3-day window. And maybe what that means is, basically, if we shrink the number of votes that will be counted up, once you count them up, it'll favor Trump instead of Biden. Therefore, the legislature doesn't need to deny the outcome. They'll get the electors that, the votes that should have been counted reflected. And so there are many ways to sort of overturn or subvert an election that doesn't involve actually denying the results. There's all these different ways to try to change who votes and what counts. Gerrymandering, as I'm sure many folks know, is another way of doing that, because it's a way of deciding where the votes are counted so that when you total them all up, certain candidates win rather than others. And so it's entirely possible to see ways that people can use the ISLT to change the way elections turn out without denying the ultimate outcome. However, one other thing, this is one thing that really concerns me about this case and why I think public education around it is very important, is because of this point. I am concerned that because this narrative is sort of out there, that ISLT does permit fake electors, that if the court rules the wrong way this summer, it's suddenly going to be widely assumed that fake electors schemes are now legal. They will not be, regardless of what the Supreme Court says in this case. There are constitutional provisions and statutory provisions, including ones that are now being modified potentially through the Electoral Count Reform Act process, that will prevent states, as a legal matter, from denying the outcomes of their elections. So even there are many bad scenarios that could come out of the ISLT, but one of them is not as a legal matter permitting fake electors, but what it might do as a rhetorical matter is give folks like that political cover and legal cover, like a rhetoric or pretense, to argue that they can do that. And it's going to be very important to be equipped with the knowledge of what this thing actually is to push back if that ever happens.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much, because I found even myself when wading through the different things I was reading, even just like on Twitter or listening to podcasts, it was hard for me to distinguish. You just clarified it perfectly. And that's scary because I can get pretty wonky. And so if I have trouble distinguishing it, like how on earth are the rest of us going to help people who don't even really engage with political news to understand that? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our biggest struggles, right? So how do you message this? You know, to tell people that, you know, that everyday voter, right? This is at stake, this is what could happen, but there's a lot of things that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean, but, you know, but at the same time, you want to motivate people to act, right? Because this is such a huge election. You know, when the state legislature is potentially, you know, could be in the hands of election deniers, right? Who take this back. So like, what's a bite-sized way, I guess, if any of you know one, that we could impress upon people the importance, right, while remaining accurate as to the scope?
I think what we've seen from at least the Dobbs decision in Roe v. Wade, that, you know, an effective way to message is that you don't want to take people's rights away. So rights that they have already had, you don't take those away. And so, you know, if I were, you know, kind of crafting a message, I would absolutely start there and speak to the rights that I presently enjoy, and indicate that, you know, do I want politicians or unelected judges with no ethics criteria of their own to take away rights that I've enjoyed for X number of years, or since this is unprecedented, hundreds of years. So that's where I would start personally.
Great, I'm going to take that. Tom, how have you been describing this case to non-lawyers, kind of?
I like what Buzz is saying. I mean, this is a case about trying to melt down checks and balances, and the ultimate loser is going to be voters. I think there was a question in the chat about, well, what does this mean? How do people participate in ensuring small d democracy? And the answer is not as much as you currently can do. So let's use gerrymandering again as an example, since it's in front of the court. In the 2010s, voters in many states challenged partisan gerrymandering in federal courts under the federal Constitution. Supreme Court, now infamously in the 2019 Rucho case, said federal courts don't have the ability to resolve these kinds of disputes, so we're closing our doors. You can't bring them to federal courts anymore. But state courts using state constitutions, they can take care of this problem. So if you've got a problem, go there. They told that to the voters of North Carolina in 2019. Voters in North Carolina this cycle, again, got gerrymandered. They did exactly what the Supreme Court said. They went to the state courts, and the state courts vindicated their rights. Now the gerrymanderers are telling the Supreme Court to tell voters, turns out you can't go to the states either. And so one really core implication of this case is that if the court rules the wrong way, it's going to kneecap the national movement to stop partisan gerrymandering. That's probably the most extreme abuse in terms of something that we're going to have very few options to deal with. For other things, there's still a federal constitutional law. As Meaghan was saying before, like you can still push back against fake electors using federal constitution. You can still push back against racial discrimination in voting using the federal constitution, but I mean, you're relying on the Supreme Court to do that. So we really need to avoid that outcome if we can, because we want belts and suspenders, and we're at the very least going to lose the belt while the Supreme Court is busy also kind of cutting through the suspenders. So we don't want that outcome.
We do, being voters, not politicians, and you mentioned redistricting, because we did, have pushed that redistricting reform here in the state, right? Members want to know if ISLT threatens our amendment, in the sense that we gave power to the independent commission to draw congressional lines as well. So would that mean that our commission would not have the power, and that power would solely lie with the state legislature because it has to do with federal elections?
Yeah, under the most extreme versions of the theory, yes, for exactly the reason you said, Nancy.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I want to end.
Wait, I was gonna can I say something quickly? And a slightly more hopeful twist on that is you are, in terms of the messaging, how do we educate this, all this? I remember not so many years ago, people thought redistricting was too confusing to explain to people. And now a lot of people know what gerrymandering is, and they understand that it means disempowering voters. So I think thanks to groups like yours, people like Nancy, all of you out there, people have been educated, and they do feel like the huge stakes of these things. So I have faith that these things can be communicated.
Thanks, Meaghan. Actually, I wanted to end on a question that I'll put to you first, which is, it's bigger than what we're dealing with, right in front of us with ISLT, but it has to do with what you've studied of building state-based power, right? And we, of course, we're a group, we've only existed for 5 years, and we really are trying to bring more and more people into the movement. But what have you learned, or is there any examples in other states of how we continue to build this kind of voter-led state power in the face of lots of things that you mentioned in your book, like the funding, situation, and people kind of looking now, or because of the media coverage, right, to federal cases, federal races, and thinking those are so, determinative of everything.
Yeah, my answer is not very wonky, which is one of the things I've observed keeps people coming back is fun, like enjoying being there, human relationships. Someone, especially during this time when, both democracy is crumbling, we've all been living through various nightmares in our lives. One of the things that keeps people engaged in these movements over many years is like the sense of community, the sense of purpose, reminding each other that you matter, which, all of that. I remember reading a study, and I'm gonna not get the details correct, but I remember it leaping out to me. Someone did a study on the anti-abortion movement and why people initially got involved. And I don't remember what the number is, but it was a lot of the activists did not initially become involved because they cared so much about the issue. They got involved because someone invited them, and because they enjoyed the camaraderie with the people that they were with. So I think it's easy for people like me. I won't speak for you, but it's easy for me. I can get very cynical. I can get pessimistic. I can get all kinds of things. But when I talk to people, or when I feel a sense of we're doing this together, then I I just feel better. And I no longer, you know, if there's some sort of event or protest or whatever, I no longer go to affect the change. I go for the other people to show them that I care about whatever it is. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And also that things take a long time, which we know from the civil rights movement. We know from every movement, things take a long time. There's failure along the way. But the people that I've observed, or the groups that I've observed that have hung on, like most things in life, there's short-term hurdles. We all know this, right? There's short-term hurdles, but if you stick with it, like the change does happen incrementally. And these are just sort of things, having looked at these different groups around the country. And all these things are cliches and you all know them, but just to repeat, like working together in coalition and to speaking to people about things that they value. So none of this is like rocket science, and none of it is something you haven't heard, but I do think, given all of the things that have happened in this country, in the world, what we're all contending with, it's very easy, well, for me, to have a sense of despair, to have a sense of what is the point, all of that. But I do think it's really important to keep in mind, you know, like I'm not an optimistic person, but I'm a very stubborn person. And I do think people matter. So like keeping, like whatever it is that keeps you going, just like hang on to that and find people who feel the same way, which you all have because you're part of this group. I think, again, I don't want to sound too Pollyannish or too cliche, but I think it's important to keep those things in mind, given like how hard this fight is and how hard I mean, this is my pessimistic side, how hard it will probably continue to be for, you know, for several years, if not our lifetimes.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your insights. Appreciate your time. I think we've gotten, you know, so much out of this. I'm speaking for the 150 other participants here tonight. Thank you very, very much. I will turn it over to you, Melinda, to close it out.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. And again, thank you to all of our panelists and our guests today. Thank you all for coming. We are posting an event survey into the chat. And if you all could just take a few moments to provide your feedback. Like we said, the feedback you provide helps us to keep making these events better and better and continue offering them. And then we will also have a recording of the event made available shortly. It will be available by tomorrow on our YouTube and Facebook pages. And that's it. So have a wonderful evening, everyone. And once again, thank you all for participating.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.